Well, let me continue on. The video got cut off there, so let me pick up right where the other one leaves off. So we're talking about how this conflict did not lead to more understanding, but less understanding. Um, this was the first time that really American colonists and British people from Britain that were not colonists really had interaction with each other. And they notice a lot of things about each other that they don't particularly like. There are a lot of cultural differences, and they feel disrespected on either side. From the British point of view, they're really quite irritated with the colonists in a lot of ways after the war. There were a lot of areas in which they felt like the colonists didn't cooperate or were not, really 100% in it. There were times that it was difficult to get the colonists to raise troops or to bring supplies or send money. And they kind of felt like, hey, we're fighting this for you and you're not giving it 100%, all that sort of stuff. They were also very upset that the colonists continued to trade with whoever they wanted to trade with throughout the war, that they were continuing to trade with France and Spain, which were countries that they were at war with. So they were upset about that. And we're fighting this war against these people, but you're content to still trade with them as long as you can make money off of it. The war alerted and forced the British to see just how bad that smuggling was that we've talked about. A lot of them may not have realized it was as bad as it was. And so they're really upset about all those things, feeling like the colonists are just flouting the law, using the British for their protection and all those things, but not fully cooperating when it came down to it. And there's also a cultural difference that is noticed here. You have to realize that the British considered themselves, and in some ways still do, the height of civilization, the most civilized, the most sophisticated, well-mannered people on earth. And there's a great sense of propriety and a great sense of elitism among them. And you have to think about, from their perspective, who the colonists were. What kind of people came to the colonists? Well, it was the rejects. It's the religious minorities. It's the poor people. It's the people that couldn't make it in Europe, or the people that we didn't want. And so they look down on the colonists. They see them as these kind of wild and really rough around the edges, unsophisticated, rude and crude, and just sort of backwoods kind of people. And they just don't respect them. And that of course is going to make the colonists mad. They really did see them as kind of being beneath them in some sort of a way. From the colonist perspective, they see the British as rude. They see the British as arrogant, and they were mad that the British did not, colonists fought, but they didn't rise to high command. They didn't rise to high offices. There were a lot of situations where the colonial militia might give a colonist a particular rank, but the British refused to recognize them by that rank. They would immediately demote them. And so they felt like they were being looked down upon and treated differently, and they were. You have to realize that the colonists, probably valued those things about themselves that the British didn't. They didn't see just a bunch of backwoods, rude kind of people. They saw, we're tough. We're enterprising. We do it ourselves. We're individuals. We talked about that, no hereditary aristocracy kind of thing. They had this much more egalitarian mindset about, I don't care who your family is. I don't care that you've got a big estate back in Europe. Don't talk to me like that kind of a thing. So they see the British as stuck up. They see the British as far too arrogant. Who do they think they are? Both sides are kind of doing that. Both sides are kind of like who do they think they are kind of a thing. And why are they treating us like this? So there's disrespect amongst both of them, and places where they both feel like they've kind of been wronged or disrespected by the other. Let me move over here. Going back to how this changes everything, I said that this completely changes the way that Britain governs their colonies. This is what ends that period of salutary neglect that we talked about earlier. I said that it would eventually come to an end. It comes to an end right here, 1763, because after the French and Indian War, Britain has gained a lot of territory, and they are the dominant power in North America. That means they can't afford to just sit back in London and let the colonists have at it anymore. They realize they're going to have to take more of an active role in these colonies, one, because of the responsibilities of managing this now much larger empire, but also because they realize the negative effect of how they had been doing things. They see that the colonists have gotten a little bit too independent and they don't respect British authority, and they want to rein them back in. So one of the things that they're going to have to do once the war is over is they are going to start keeping more British troops in the colony. So there's going to be a greater presence of the British Army and the British Navy in North America from now on. Now, it's not huge. I don't want you to get the idea that there are just soldiers parading the streets constantly. It's not. It is really largely a symbolic thing. In fact, a lot of the time what the colonists are mad about is that they still feel like the British are not protecting them enough. But usually it's also vocalized as just, why are these troops here? The war is over. Why do you have them amongst us? Which, keep in mind also, having a standing army around during peacetime was against the law in Britain. And that really becomes more of an issue later, but it kind of comes back to the French and Indian War. At this point, the colonists are really not even so mad about the troops themselves, because they kind of realize that those troops are there for their protection. We're mostly talking about troops on that western border to protect against Native American attacks and those kind of things. What the colonists really get mad about at this point is the fact that they got to help pay for it. If there's going to be a stronger military presence of the British, that has to be paid for. That means a big expense, and the British are certainly going to look to the colonists to help pay for the troops that are now going to be there for their protection. So how are they going to do that? Well, a couple of different things. So in order to help pay for the troops that now have to be in the colonies and to pay off massive debt, you have to realize that this war was incredibly expensive as wars go. The British now have all this great new territory, but they are in debt by a great deal, a huge national debt that they've got to pay off. And they have also realized throughout the course of the French and Indian War, as I was saying, how bad that smuggling was, how much the colonists are flouting the law. And they also crunch some numbers and realize how much money they are losing because they haven't been enforcing those navigation acts for the past 100 years. So one of the first things they're going to do once the French and Indian War is over is the British government is now going to start enforcing those navigation acts. They haven't been doing that, as I said, for nearly 100 years. The colonists have been smuggling. Well, time's up. They are now going to start enforcing those laws and collecting those taxes and inspecting those shipments and all of that. One, to pay off debt and to pay for these troops, but also just to get the colonists back in line, to kind of send that message that you have to obey the law and we're not just going to look the other way anymore. So you can imagine that the colonists aren't going to take too kindly to that. It's just like any situation. Think about it. I'm sure there's been instances while you've been in school of, there's a rule that the school doesn't enforce and everybody just ignores it or gets away with it, and then one day or a new principal comes in, or teacher's in a bad mood and they decide they're going to enforce the rule that day. You get pretty mad about it and you say, well, you didn't write me up yesterday, so why are you writing me up now? Same thing with the colonists, except on a much bigger scale. And it is also not just the fact that the navigation acts are being enforced, it's the way that they're being enforced that the colonists are going to have a big problem. The British are going to start using what are called vice admiralty courts, and vice admiralty courts are military courts. This is how they're going to prosecute and bring to trial smugglers and people that are disobeying the law. And if they are military courts, the big difference is they don't have a jury. There's no jury in a vice admiralty court. And so the colonists feel that this violates their rights, specifically their right to a trial by jury. And remember, these are rights that we're talking about that were written down in the English Bill of Rights. So the colonists feel they have a more than legitimate claim that this is illegal. First, you have civilians being tried in military court, and there is no jury. Now, up until now, the outcry against this is a lot of complaining and, people just saying they're not really taking too much action against it. They're going to continue to smuggle. The British never get a handle on the smuggling, but we haven't seen colonists taking to the streets yet, so we're not to that. Even with the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, it's still not enough. One, because it just wasn't enough to pay off the debt, and they never can get a handle on the smuggling. And so that is why in 1764, the British government parliament passes the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act placed a tax on sugar, clearly. And this was much different than anything the British government has done before, because the entire purpose of the Sugar Act was to raise revenue. Revenue means money. They're trying to raise revenue specifically to pay off that debt, and that makes it very different. The Navigation Acts, yes, those are taxes, but those are taxes on trade that were really for the purpose of trade regulation, maintaining the balance of trade and that sort of thing. It wasn't so much about raising money for a specific purpose, and that's where the colonists are going to object to this. Some of them would say, you know, we may not have liked the Navigation Acts. We don't think that's fun. But they did concede that Parliament did have the authority to pass the Navigation Acts, that it was within their right to pass the Navigation Acts and regulate colonial trade. The Sugar Act, though, some of those same people will go, well, you don't have that right. You can regulate trade, but you can't just make money off of us, and that's wrong. So because this is the first revenue-raising measure, this causes a lot of fuss in the colonies as well. And they're also still using the Vice Admiralty courts and all of that. For the most part, the colonists try to get around this by continuing to smuggle. As I said, they never stop doing that. But the tension is starting to build. Now, for the most part at this point, like I said, we're not to mass protest yet. Regular everyday folks probably don't even really notice this is going on all that much, because these are taxes on trade. And so the only people that are really going to be that aware of it, or that are really going to be super affected by it, are merchants, you know, people that are directly involved in trade. But to the average colonist walking into the store to buy a pound of sugar, they probably won't notice it. They probably, you know, they might notice that it went up by a penny or something like that, but not enough to make people just lose their mind over it. But that's about to change. One of the first things we will look at in the next chapter is how things get more and more heated when the British do start taxing in a bit of a different way, which they actually think is going to be more fair, but something that is going to cause the colonists to rise up in mass protest. So the situation has changed. There's no going back at this point, and it continues to snowball from here.